Let's go ahead and take a look at the determinants of demand for the loanable funds market. So things that are going to shift our entire demand curve to the right or to the left. And these are going to be anything that changes the rate of return on potential investment will cause the demand for loanable funds to change. And remember we said that there were three entities that could fall on both sides of the market, individuals like you and I, firms and corporations, and then the governments. On the demand side, we typically hit on the firms and corporations just a little bit more. So when we go through all these determinants that we see right here, we typically are talking about firms and corporations rather than individuals and governments. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at each one of these determinants. So the determinants of demand for loanable funds. Determinants of demand for loanable funds. And in this instance, let's go ahead and take a look at the demand is going to be increasing in this particular market. So here we have our typical supply and demand curve. We have the interest rate on the vertical axis. We have quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis. Bring up D0, S0, initial equilibrium at point A. And of course, this particular intersection tells us exactly where our original interest rate is and the original quantity of loanable funds. Let's go ahead and take a look at things that are going to increase the demand for these loanable funds. So how exactly do we get more people to demand these loanable funds or demand for money in this instance? And remember that anytime we have an increase in demand, we end up at point B, our new intersection point. And this is going to lead us to having a higher interest rate. We go from R0 to R1, and we have a higher amount of funds, so LF1. So anytime demand increases, when we have demand increases, it's going to lead to interest rates increasing, which is the price of the usage of money. So interest rates increase. And then we also notice that quantity of loanable funds also increases. So quantity of loanable funds increases as well. So here, two increases in the main variables we're taking a look at in this particular market. So let's go ahead and take a look at demand increases. There are going to be 6 determinants that we go ahead and take a look at. First, we take a look at investment tax incentives. Investment tax incentives. So here, this is going to create some type of incentive for firms and corporations to want to go ahead and make new investments or undergo new projects. What do we need the government to do in order for the firms and corporations to have more demand for money, or sort of just go ahead and go to the banks and say, hey, give me a loan, that type of idea? Well, we need to have better investment tax incentives. So with better investment tax incentives, the government says to this firm or corporation, if you undertake this particular project or undertake this particular research, we'll go ahead and give you a tax break for that. And that is, of course, going to incentivize firms and corporations to go ahead and say, that's a really good deal. Let's go ahead, undertake this project. Let's go to the bank, get out some type of loan and do exactly what the government wants us to do because they'll give us a tax break. So here, once again, it just incentivizes these firms and corporations to want to go ahead and borrow money from the banks. Next, we take a look at technological advances. Technological advances. And with technological advances, we need to go ahead and have better technological advances in order for firms and corporations, once again, to borrow money from banks. So they're demanding money from the banks. As technology improves, firms and corporations want the best technology that's available to them because that'll make them more efficient, more productive. And as that sort of transition happens, they are going to go on and go ahead and get the best technology possible. They're going to go ahead, take out loans from the bank in order to get this technology, and that is going to once again be a shift of the demand curve outwards. Next, we take a look at regulations, and this is actually where we can break regulations down into 2 specific parts. We can take a look at regulations that impose higher costs or regulations that reduce corruption. So let's go ahead and break these 2 pieces down. So here, regulations that impose higher costs. And of course, firms and corporations do not like regulations that impose higher costs because that, of course, that's going to reduce their profits. So therefore, we need to have less of these regulations in order for them to want to go ahead and borrow more money from the banks. However, when we take a look at the opposite side, regulations that reduce corruption. Regulations that reduce Corruption. Even though there is a lot of corruption in the business environment, we do typically generally say that businesses and firms don't want a lot of corruption. So as the government imposes more and more regulations that lowers corruption, this can reduce the cost of doing business for these firms and corporations. So therefore, these are the types of regulations we want to see more of. So less regulations that impose higher costs, more regulations that reduce corruption, has the inert sort of ability of shifting our demand curve away from the origin. Next, we take a look at product demand. Product demand. And product demand is exactly that. Exactly what you and I, what the sort of marketplace, what the economy is demanding for this particular sort of firms or corporations' products. And we need to go ahead and have higher product demand here. Higher product demand. With higher product demand, it just tells us that, hey, we want more of this firm or corporation's good or services. And because there's higher demand, the firm or corporation has to keep up with that demand. So therefore, they're going to have to ramp up the production process, the production methods. And in order to do so, they need more money. So therefore, they're going to go to the bank, borrow a lot of money in order to match up with their current demand. And then finally here, we take a look at expectations. Once again, we have business expectations. Business expectations. With business expectations, we need to have better business expectations. So if the firm or corporations have a better sort of idea of where the economy is heading, they think it's going to be more positive, they're going to want to go ahead and take advantage of that to exploit it. They're going to go ahead and borrow money from the banks. The demand for loanable funds goes up, and they're going to use that money in order for them to set themselves in a better sort of position as the economy does get better. So all of these that we see right here, these are all the determinants of demand for loanable funds. Remember, these are the only things that are going to be affecting our demand side. We already took a look at the supply side, and we saw exactly that we move these sort of curves in one particular direction. In order to see what happens in the opposite case, where demand decreases, for instance, where just go ahead and change everything that you see underlined here to the opposite side, and then shift your demand curve in towards the origin. So what is going to be our final step when we take a look at the demand and supply of these loanable funds? It's to go ahead and take a look at all these shifts individually and simultaneously to see exactly what happens to our macroeconomic equilibrium interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds. So it's something that we're never going to get away from. We've pretty much seen it since chapter number 3. So these shifts of supply and demand both individually and simultaneously, and we'll give you a few examples of that in the next section as we wrap up the idea of the loanable funds market.